if I could have your attention, thanks very much for coming. I guess the size of the room is an indicator of the fact that this issue is obviously very much in the news. I'd like to introduce myself first. I'm Stephen Haggard. I direct the Korea Pacific program here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, and I teach courses on Korean security and international relations in the Asia Pacific. This is part of a lecture series that Eric Gartzka has brought over to GPS from his Center for Peace and Security Studies over in political science. And what we're trying to do in this series is bring in people from the intelligence community who have worked at great detail on these issues of nonproliferation and get them to explain how they work, what they found, and what we know. And what we're going to be talking about today is a crucial period in North Korea's nuclear development. Kim Il-sung showed an interest in developing nuclear power as early as the 50s, but particularly in the late 80s and into what we call the first nuclear crisis, which broke in 1992 and was finally resolved in 1994, we see a real acceleration of interest in acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. And that's running in parallel with ballistic missile technology development that also begins to ratchet up in the 1980s. And as our guest today will say, this process has just simply continued into the current Kim Jong-un period. So let me just thank a few people who have made this possible. First of all, I want to thank the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center. They provide very generous funding for Torrey to come out. And then some groups on campus that have helped us distribute the word on this and gotten some of you out here. UC San Diego's International Institute and the Center for Transnational Korean Studies, which I also work on, which does campus-related work on Korea. Let me introduce Torrey Froscher. I've had the pleasure of talking to him here this afternoon for some time and talking to him about his career. I can talk about formal titles, but the main thing you need to know about Torrey is he spent 35 years at the CIA, basically working on issues of nonproliferation. And he's not a regional person, he's a technical person. So this is about how we discern the capabilities that the North Koreans have developed over time. He's worked in analytic units that were concerned with nuclear test monitoring, with nuclear proliferation generally, with biological and chemical weapons. But he rose to position as chief of analysis for the Nonproliferation Center at the CIA, which is preoccupied primarily with these issues of intelligence about adversaries and their nuclear capabilities. So Torrey, I think what we'll do is we'll let you talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and then I might ask the first question, but the rest of the time we'll give it to the audience so they can...
Great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Haggard. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Haggard, for that introduction. Can everybody hear me all right? Can you hear me? Okay.
Let me just adjust here. Just raise it up a little bit. We've got him mic'd
I feel
in
like
two or three ways. There you go. I think that was good.
Okay, is that better? If I fade out or anything, please let me know. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. North Korea is very much in the news these days, but I'm not going to talk about the current program, what's going on today in North Korea. This is, by my count, the third North Korean nuclear crisis. As Professor Haggard mentioned, you go back to when we first became concerned about North Korea's nuclear program in the 1980s, so I'm going to start there. Then I'm going to move through the first North Korean nuclear crisis, which was from 1992 to 1994, which culminated in the so-called agreed framework when the North Koreans agreed to freeze their plutonium production infrastructure, that is the reactor and reprocessing facility that they had at Yongbyon, that they still have at Yongbyon. And then I'll go into the second North Korean nuclear crisis in 2003, 2002, when, as a result of the U.S. confronting North Korea about evidence concerning their efforts in the uranium enrichment area, the agreed framework came to an end. So that was 2002, 2003, almost exactly 15 years ago. And I think you can say that the circumstances that were in place in 2003 at the end of the agreed framework, all the factors were there at that time that have led to the situation that we face today in North Korea. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about the intelligence community's role in assessing and supporting policymakers' efforts to deal with North Korea's nuclear program over the years, and a little bit about what we did well, perhaps what we could have done a little bit better. And it's a lot of ground to cover, but as Professor Haggard said, I'll try to do that in 30 to 40 minutes and leave time for your questions. So let me start by, can you see this view graph? Can we dim the lights? The first thing to say about the early 1980s is that things were different then. The main focus of attention was still the Cold War, the US-Soviet competition. Things were seen through that prism. Nonproliferation was a second-tier issue. It did not get the attention that it does today. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty was only about 10 years old at the beginning of that decade, and the nonproliferation norm had not been fully established. Many countries had not yet signed on to the NPT, including France, China, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, even Spain in 1980 had not signed on. Those of us in the intelligence community working on nonproliferation issues were focused on what we sometimes called the dirty dozen. There were some familiar names on this list like India, Pakistan, Iraq, and also some other countries that we aren't as concerned about these days, such as Argentina, Brazil, and South Africa. In Asia, North Korea was not one of those countries. We were not focused on North Korea. Our concern in Asia was South Korea and Taiwan, because both of those countries in the mid-70s had inchoate nuclear weapons programs, largely as a result of concerns that they had about the nature of US security guarantees. The programs in those two countries were detected at a very early stage, and the US exerted a lot of pressure to turn those programs off. We did know that North Korea was interested in nuclear power, and that they had been talking to the Soviets about getting nuclear power reactors. The Soviets provided a research reactor to the North Koreans in the 1970s, established a nuclear research center at Yongbyon, and we were watching that research center. Around 1980, we noticed a new reactor under construction there, a second reactor in addition to the IRT research reactor that the Soviets had provided. By 1984, it took a few years until construction on that reactor had progressed to the stage that we could tell much about it. But by April 1984, it was clear that the reactor had a significant capability, would have a significant capacity to produce plutonium when it was completed. And so the intelligence community, we sent out a warning notice to policymakers, letting them know that a reactor was under construction at Yongbyon that represented a significant step towards a North Korean nuclear weapons capability. So now the North Korean program was on the scope. It was on the policymakers' list of issues to worry about. And the obvious thing to do, since we knew that they were talking to Moscow about power reactors, was to press the Soviet Union to insist that before they reached any agreement with North Korea about power reactors, that they get North Korea to sign the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which they had not done. During the Cold War, nuclear proliferation issues were one of those few topics that we pretty much saw eye to eye with the Soviets, and there was some cooperation. And in fact, they did press the North Koreans, and the North Koreans did sign the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty in December 1985. 2 weeks later, they signed a contract with the North Koreans to provide power reactors. Of course, that never came to fruition. So this was the first time the problem was solved in 1995, or 1985, when the North Koreans signed the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. This was seen as a breakthrough. It suggested peaceful intent. Now again, this is an aspect of how thinking may have changed back in the 80s from what it is today. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, they signed up to it, they're going to accept safeguards, the reactor is at a known site, so, and we knew the North Koreans were interested in nuclear power, so there were a lot of reasons to think initially that perhaps this reactor was for peaceful purposes. At least that's what the early IC assessments noted, that that was a significant possibility. They also always noted the weapons potential. But the IC judgments in those early years were cautious about the actual purpose and did not immediately conclude that it was for nuclear weapons development. By 1987, there was a second large building under construction there that was suspected of being a reprocessing facility, a building where the spent fuel from the reactor would be processed, and the plutonium in that spent fuel, after having been irradiated in the reactor, would be separated. So that's a stage in producing plutonium after the fuel has been irradiated in the reactor. And there was uncertainty about the purpose of it, and there was some controversy about it, and this was taken a little bit as a proxy about the purpose of the activity. The belief was that if this was a reprocessing facility for the purpose of separating plutonium, then it was more likely that this activity was weapons related. If it was not a reprocessing facility, then it was more likely peaceful. Now, I think there are some problems with that analysis, and I'll come back to that a little bit, but that was the tenor of much of the analysis at that time. So as the 80s go on, get to the late 80s, there was increasing concern, but policymakers were slow to take further action because there were not too many good options seen. When you sign the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, you're supposed to accept IAEA safeguards. You're supposed to declare your nuclear facilities and accept safeguards implemented by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. Well, the IAEA made a mistake. They sent the wrong forms to the North Koreans. You're supposed to make this declaration within 18 months. 18 months after the North Koreans joined the NPT, they still have not declared their facilities. The IAEA figures out they made a mistake. They send the correct forms. They reset the clock. Another 18 months passes. The North Koreans still make no declaration of their nuclear activities, do not accept safeguards. So we're now 3 years after December 1985, December 1988. There's the controversy about the reprocessing facility. People are getting increasingly concerned. But again, the policymakers are slow to take further action. What can we do? We press the Russians again, the Soviets, but the Soviets say, well, there's nothing we can do. We've tried. So that's where things stood at the end of 1998. So 1989, things began to move more quickly. In May of 1989, the Bush administration briefed South Korea for the first time on the nature of North Korea nuclear activity, including the reprocessing facility. And this led to the first press accounts of the weapons potential of the facilities under construction in North Korea that appeared in May, June 1989. And so it was beginning to get some public attention, and the public attention tended to focus naturally on the weapons potential of what was going on in North Korea. At the same time, geopolitical changes were putting extreme pressure on the North Koreans as their traditional suppliers, supplier states that provided them aid. Soviet Union was breaking up. China was cozying up to the South Koreans. Both the Soviets and the Chinese were reaching out to South Korea and leaving North Korea feeling very isolated and very pressured. In the United States, as I mentioned, there was growing policy concern, but still a reluctance to face the issue because there aren't too many options that we're seeing here. This is a situation, even then, where there are no good options. The intelligence assessments were becoming more concerned, but they still held back from declaring that this was clearly a nuclear weapons program. For example, a National Intelligence Council memorandum in 1991 noted that potential economic sanctions would not cause North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons program. These are declassified assessments. January 1992 analysis warned that you could not ensure termination of Pyongyang's program and that the weapons program, I'm sorry, that's the wrong quote. The mid-1991 talking points noted serious questions about North Korean intentions and stressed the need to deal with Pyongyang's potential development of nuclear weapons by mid-decade. So these 1991 assessments are still warning of the potential of North Korea's nuclear weapons program, but not making the judgment that they actually have one. So in 1992, in the fall of 1991, some developments elsewhere in the world allowed significant progress to be made on the Korean Peninsula. As the USSR was collapsing, the US took advantage of that situation to pull back forward deployed nuclear forces around the world, including in South Korea. We withdrew our nuclear weapons from South Korea in the context of this global pullback. The North Koreans, of course, had been complaining about our weapons in South Korea for many years, and this provided an opportunity to withdraw them without appearing to be reacting directly to North Korea's concerns. This had a galvanizing impact on the dialogue both between the North and the South and between the North and the International Atomic Energy Agency. In the fall of 1991, North and South began talking. They reached agreement on a non-aggression pact. They reached agreement on a denuclearization agreement to make the peninsula nuclear free and to prohibit enrichment and reprocessing facilities. And early in 1992, the North Koreans finally declared their nuclear program at Yongbyon to the IAEA and accepted safeguards. They declared the reactor, the 5 megawatt electric reactor at Yongbyon, 2 larger reactors that were under construction, one at Yongbyon and one nearby. And they declared what they called a reprocessing laboratory, really a reprocessing facility. And they surprised the IAEA and the United States by saying that this facility had actually already operated. They declared that they had separated less than 100 grams, a very small quantity, of plutonium in experiments and in the process of dissolving failed fuel elements as the reactor was being tested. So the IAEA made their first visits to Yongbyon in May, and at first the visits went very well. The North Koreans even offered to let the IAEA go anywhere they wanted in North Korea, even if they had not declared the site. So this was the second time the problem was solved, quote unquote. People thought, this is great. We've taken care of the North Korean nuclear problem. So at almost the same time, though, the intelligence community views on the intention, on North Korean intentions were hardening. And this is the quote I mentioned earlier. December 1991 National Intelligence Community Memorandum judged that North Korea would not abandon its nuclear weapons program. So in contrast to the earlier judgments, which were saying we're concerned about our nuclear weapons program, they may be moving in that direction, they certainly have that potential. By late 1991, the estimates are saying they're not going to give up this nuclear weapons program. They have a nuclear weapons program. We're concerned the nuclear weapons program is going to go underground in the face of IAEA inspections. So I'll talk a little bit more about that change later. Of course, the basis for this change isn't clear in the available material. There may well be more explanation in the classified record, but of course everything I'm telling you here is based on what has been made public and what has been declassified. So as I said, first inspections, first visits in May 1992, things were looking pretty good. But by the summer of 1992, there were some problems surfacing. The IAEA became concerned about inconsistencies in the North Korean declaration. Based on radiochemical analysis of samples that they collected at Yongbyon, they began to question whether or not North Korea had in fact reprocessed more than the less than 100 grams that they declared. The concern was that they might have actually discharged an entire core of irradiated fuel from the reactor and reprocessed it, in which case if they had done that, There could have been as much as, at the time it was thought, 12 kilograms. Later that number was reduced to 8 kilograms of plutonium. That information based on radiochemical analysis was supplemented by intelligence information that indicated that there were possibly suspect concealed waste storage sites near the reprocessing facilities that might have contained waste from that undeclared reprocessing campaign. The intelligence community briefed the IAEA on this information, and they used for the first time in an international forum satellite photography of these suspect waste sites to explain what was going on. This was the first time, as I said, that this kind of imagery had been used in an international forum. You have to understand, of course, satellite imagery was not ubiquitous then like it is today. There was no digital globe or Planet Labs, and so this use of satellite imagery had a tremendous impact, and it led the IAEA Board of Governors to vote to request of the IAEA that there be special inspections of these waste sites. Rather than comply with this request or demand for special inspections, the North Koreans in March 1993 declared their intention to withdraw from the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. They gave the 3-month notice required by the treaty of their intention to withdraw. In June, in negotiations with the United States, they suspended their withdrawal at the very last minute with 1 day left. And so it was a tense situation. Later in that same year, in November 1993, the intelligence community wrote their first estimate on North Korea's nuclear program, in which they judged that there was a better than even chance that North Korea had already produced enough plutonium for 1 or possibly 2 nuclear weapons. So in other words, in that ambiguity, that question about how much plutonium have they actually separated, the NIE is judging a better than even chance that they had already separated some number close to the high end of that range. Now, of course, better than even chance, that's not really a very high confidence or a very strong judgment. It could be a 51-40, 51-49 sort of thing. But when you make these kind of judgments, nobody tends to remember that. It came across perhaps more strongly than anticipated. It had a big impact in the policy community. They didn't like this NIE, to say the least. Bob Gallucci said that, who was the chief U.S. negotiator with the North Koreans at that time, this NIE shed no light on the issue, but plenty of heat. In his view, it did nothing more than damage administration credibility and make their job more difficult. Whatever the merits of the NIE, it foreshadowed an increasing polarization in the intelligence community and judgments about North Korea. As noted here, the State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which is the element in the State Department that is their part of the intelligence community, dissented from that view. So again, this foreshadows an increasing polarization in the intelligence community. The DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, is sort of on the other end of that polarization, already concluding by this time that North Korea not only has a nuclear weapons program, but will not give it up under any circumstances. So the North Koreans, as I said, they decide to stay in the Nonproliferation Treaty, but they claim now that they have a special status since they have this agreement with the United States. Relations with the International Atomic Energy Agency are difficult. The North Koreans are giving the IAEA problems whenever they go to Yongbyon. And then in April 1994, the crisis ramps up because the North Koreans began unloading the spent fuel in the reactor. The reactor had been operating all this time. The fuel needed to be discharged, and they began that process. The spent fuel contained enough plutonium for another 4 to 5 nuclear weapons. And this was a problem not only because it's a step towards separating that plutonium for potential use in nuclear weapons, which, by the way, doing that would not necessarily be illegal under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty as long as it was safeguarded, done with IAEA being present, and the plutonium was safeguarded and not used in weapons. Obviously, the United States would not at all be happy with that situation. but the North Koreans could argue that it was not inconsistent with the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. But the proximate reason why it was a concern was that the North Koreans were discharging that fuel while not allowing the IAEA to take the sort of measurements and make the kind of observations that would be necessary to determine whether or not that original declaration was correct or not. So the issue at this point is still, is the North Korean original declaration correct? Are they correct that they have only reprocessed less than 100 grams of material, or is it a larger amount? So the crisis builds. In June, the Clinton administration is considering building up military forces and evacuating US citizens from South Korea. That same month, former President Jimmy Carter, basically on his own initiative, without any brief from the Clinton administration, goes to North Korea, meets with Kim Il-sung, comes back from meetings with Kim Il-sung and says, North Koreans are ready to freeze their program at Yongbyon, put it on ice, no longer operate the reactor, not reprocess the spent fuel that they discharged, in return for us providing light water reactors and improved relations with the United States. This was actually something that the administration learned about over CNN at pretty much the exact moment that Secretary of Defense Bill Perry was briefing in the White House on proposals to build up US forces in Korea. So it took a few more months of negotiation, but in October the agreed framework was negotiated, which froze the program. And importantly, and often overlooked, the agreed framework changed the focus of concern and immediate attention from the past to the future. The past being that question of whether or not the North Koreans' initial declaration was correct. The future being the possibility of production and separation of additional plutonium. So the agreed framework put the question of North Korea's compliance with the NPT requirements up until that point on the shelf to be evaluated later, according to the terms of the agreed framework, after significant progress had been made on the light water reactor construction, but before the delivery of key components. So the agreed framework. As I mentioned, North Korea freezed the plutonium program and eventually dismantled the facilities. IAEA to verify compliance. Spent fuel to be disposed of without reprocessing, which is a complicated and difficult task. An international consortium to provide two 1,000 megawatt light water power reactors. But basically the North Koreans are holding the US responsible for doing this, although they're going to be South Korean reactors. The US to provide heavy fuel oil to compensate for the freeze. The North Korean argument is these reactors are for power purposes. We're going to freeze them, and therefore you need to compensate us for the energy lost. You need to provide us with heavy fuel oil, and we agreed to do that. US gives assurance against threat of nuclear use, move towards full normalization of relations. The North Koreans are called on to implement the North-South denuclearization agreement that was reached in late 1991. North Korea to stay in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and accept safeguards. And as I mentioned, the North Koreans to come into full compliance with safeguards, meaning resolve that issue of the historical question of whether or not they have actually only got less than 100 grams of plutonium or have up to 8 to 12 kilograms of plutonium. They have to satisfy the IAEA about that issue before the delivery of key components for the light water reactors. So that's a lot, that's a big agenda, all that in 4 pages in the agreed framework. So the agreed framework marked a new role for the intelligence community with the IAEA now at Yongbyon. You know, before the IAEA was at Yongbyon in 1992, if you wanted to know anything about what's going on at Yongbyon, you had to ask the intelligence community because nobody had ever been there, except the IAEA did go to the Soviet-provided research reactor, the IRT, but when they did that, they did not see any of the other facilities at Yongbyon. So up until that point, if you wanted to know about anything else at Yongbyon, you wanted to know about the plutonium production reactor, you had to ask the intelligence community. But with the IAEA at Yongbyon, with the agreed framework in in place, the intelligence community job shifted, and the concern now was we now needed to look for the possibility of undeclared nuclear activities anywhere in North Korea. Obviously a much more difficult job. And so this is where preconceptions and beliefs and assumptions come into place. If, like the Defense Intelligence Agency, as I already mentioned, on the more hardline side of interpreting North Korean behavior, if you are convinced that North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear weapons program, no matter what, and they have agreed to a freeze on the plutonium production facilities at Yongbyon, the only place that we know of where they have the potential capability, then obviously there has to be nuclear weapons related facilities somewhere else in North Korea. And I think that thinking was a factor in the identification of a suspect plutonium production site at a place called Kumchang-ri in North Korea. This issue was briefed to Congress aggressively by DIA. It became a part of the internal debate in the administration about the agreed framework. And after some negotiations, the North Korean, and the provision of, I think, 400,000 tons of food aid in compensation, the North Koreans permitted the U.S. to inspect this site, and it was found that it was unsuitable for nuclear use. So that issue was certainly an embarrassment for the intelligence community, an example of the greater challenges associated with the intelligence community job after the agreed framework. There were also, almost from the beginning of the agreed framework, concerns about uranium enrichment activity in North Korea. By the late 1990s, there was indications that the AQ-CON network, the Pakistani AQ-CON network, had been dealing with North Korea in this area. But according to the testimony of U.S. officials dealing with this at the time in the administration, by the end of the Clinton administration in 2000, according to Bob Einhorn and others' testimony, this was seen as being at the research and development level. So the Clinton administration attitude was, we're concerned about this, we need to follow up on it at some point, but we're going to basically deal with that at another stage. In the latter years of the Clinton administration, there was a big focus on getting a missile moratorium, and that's another subject. I'm not talking much about missiles here, but basically it was on their scope, but they hadn't done anything about it. So the role of intelligence and the demise of the agreed frameworks, and now we're coming into the second North Korean nuclear crisis. 2001, the new Bush administration came into office, and they were divided about how to proceed on the North Korean issue. After a considerable amount of debate in mid-2002, they had settled on what they called the bold approach, which was basically an effort to sort of expand the scope of discussions with North Korea. But at about the same time, in mid-2002, before there was a chance to re-engage with North Korean representatives, there were new intelligence reports that Pyongyang was procuring centrifuge materials in large quantities, significant quantities, and the estimate reportedly was that this meant these materials were sufficient that by the middle of the decade, the North Koreans could have a highly enriched uranium production plant sufficient to produce material for 2 to 4, I believe it was, nuclear weapons per year. And so the concern is the plutonium route is frozen, but the North Koreans appear to be developing facilities to develop fissile material for nuclear weapons using this other route, highly enriched uranium. So the skeptic faction in the Bush administration basically used this information to change the guidance of the U.S. representative, Jim Kelly, who was going to go to Pyongyang to introduce discussions of this bold approach. Instead, he was given instructions that were rather narrow and restrictive. He was basically told, we want you to confront the North Koreans about this HEU program. We want you to tell them that they have to dismantle it before we have any more discussions. It's a precondition to further talks. After initially denying it on the second day of discussions, much to the surprise of the U.S. delegation, the North Koreans ambiguously acknowledged or appeared to acknowledge that they had a HEU, highly enriched uranium program. They later denied that they had a program until 2009. So it took a couple more months for events to play out, but the U.S. decided in November, as a result of the North Korean refusal to engage on this issue, that they would no longer provide heavy fuel oil shipments. Heavy fuel oil, as I mentioned, being the compensation for the freeze. So when this was announced, the North Koreans noted, hey, you know, that's a violation of an explicit provision in the agreed framework. If you do that, we're going to declare the agreed framework null and void. And once that heavy fuel oil shipment did end, the North Koreans very quickly expelled IAEA inspectors, removed all the IAEA seals from the reactor, restarted began reprocessing that spent fuel, completed their withdrawal from the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the 1 day left, they took that 1 day and withdrew. All that in a very short period of time, very quickly. I think they escalated it much more quickly than anybody had really anticipated. And in March 2003, in private discussions, the North Koreans told the US that the spent fuel would be converted for use in a nuclear deterrent. This is the first time they abandoned the fig leaf that the program was solely for peaceful purposes, but they chose that moment to do so. Of course, March 2003 was also the moment that the US was poised to invade Iraq. And in this exchange, they basically told us that we're not going to be like Iraq. We don't want you to invade us, and we're going to make sure we have a nuclear deterrent so you do not invade us. So I think it's fair to say that the skeptics in the Bush administration used the HEU issue to win the debate internally, and as John Bolton famously says in his memoirs, the HEU program was the hammer he was looking for to smash the agreed framework. There was a lot of people who did not like the agreed framework and were eager to kill it. But I think it's also important to note that the agreed framework was in trouble, arguably from day one. It was likely doomed in any case. There was a lot of thinking that the North Korean regime will collapse before we ever have to complete this, so let's not worry about these complicated things. But there were political problems in the U.S. from the beginning. As I mentioned, the agreed framework, because it puts aside the question of the historical accuracy of the North Koreans' initial declaration, it gives the impression of allowing a violation to go on without addressing it. There were continued compliance concerns, the Kumchang-ri issue, the HEU issue, North Korean provocations, the 1998 Taepodong launch, the first time the North Koreans launched a missile that crossed over Japan, continued friction with the International Atomic Energy Agency, lack of progress on North-South issues. The provision of light water reactors, perhaps most important, faced insuperable obstacles. It's hard to see how that ever could have come to pass. There were protracted delays. The North Koreans were already complaining bitterly about the delays. There were always ongoing funding problems. Liability, perhaps the biggest issue. A big issue with nuclear reactors always is who is going to be responsible for liabilities in case there's an accident at this reactor. Because a nuclear accident at a power reactor can easily have enough liability issues to bankrupt the company that built it. So who's going to guarantee the reliability and the liability of a reactor in North Korea? It's not going to happen. And also, the U.S. tended to think about this issue purely in terms of nonproliferation, where it's stopping or freezing the North Korean program. The North Koreans saw this, as Bob Carlin always reminds us, in a much bigger framework. They saw this as a way to normalize relations with the United States. They basically wanted a get out of jail free card from the US. They wanted the US not only to assure that we would not take any hostile action towards them, but we basically wanted them to validate the legitimacy of their government as a sovereign state. And that's a tall order for us, for a member of the axis of evil to do something like that. So let me get to lessons learned quickly. How well did the intelligence community do on this job? And of course, North Korea is famously the hardest of the hard targets. Very little information about what's going on in North Korea, and we're basically relying on overhead imagery here. But the IC did warn policymakers at an early stage of North Korea's potential to develop nuclear weapons. They provided extensive support to the International Atomic Energy Agency efforts in organizing and monitoring the grid framework. But there was room for improvement in some areas. The judgment of intent evolved, as I mentioned, without clear explanation, and the policy disagreements, I would argue, were mirrored in intelligence community differences. I'll talk a little bit more about that. There's a distinction that's sometimes made between a mystery and a puzzle. And a puzzle is something that if you have the right information, you can give an answer. And S&T analysis, as Professor Haggard mentioned, I'm a technical analyst. Basically, it was my function in the intelligence community. We look at we look at facilities and we try to figure out what their capabilities are. If you get the right information, that's a puzzle. But what people really want to know is, what can you do with these facilities? What are they going to do with these facilities? What is their purpose? And that is an intent question. That is a mystery, and it involves things that are maybe not knowable. It involves political issues. It involves what's in people's head. And there is a temptation that you often see to cite technical factors in assessing or characterizing intent, probably because you've got that technical information, and also because there is this scientific aura about it. It has a credibility that goes with it being a scientific method. And so, for example, the debates about reprocessing that I mentioned earlier, when people asked the question about, is that facility at Yongbyon a reprocessing facility, they used that as a proxy for the issue of intent. Is this a weapons facility, or is this for weapons purposes, or is it for peaceful purposes? But I think in retrospect, that's really, you have to say that was probably not a well-grounded debate, because this reactor, the fuel of this reactor, and this was well known at the time. It was no secret then, it's no secret now. It's natural uranium fuel with magnesium cladding that deteriorates when you discharge it from the reactor. You put it in a cooling pond, it deteriorates. You end up with a radioactive mess unless you reprocess it. So it basically requires reprocessing. And so the question of whether or not this is a reprocessing facility and whether or not that is an intent, that is an indicator of weapons intent, is probably not the right connection. Another thing people would look at is, well, is this reactor connected to the electric power grid? Is it a power reactor? And that also, I think, is not really a good indicator, because this reactor is based on a British facility that was used for both power and weapons. The history of this reactor is that the electrical connection is irrelevant. This technology was originally developed in the UK, and the Calder Hall reactor that this is based on was used both for plutonium production for weapons and electric power generation. So just because it's generating electric power doesn't mean it's not being used for weapons, and vice versa. So that gets to the next question about why the IC judgment of intent changed in 1991, 1992. As it did, and again, this is speculative here because we don't know exactly all the evidence and argumentation that went into this. And it's not as if the IC wasn't emphasizing the possibility and the potential of weapons as use, but it seemed to get more positive about the weapons applications in 1991, 1992. My argument is that this is basically a reflection in a change in a broader context of relevant beliefs and assumptions. It's kind of the things that everybody knows and believes but doesn't really articulate because it's so widely accepted that it doesn't really come into your mind when you think about the problem. And this gets back to the point I mentioned earlier about things being different in the 1980s. The North Koreans were seen as having little technological capability or motivation to pursue weapons, and we knew that they had been talking about nuclear power reactors, so we tended to think about nuclear power first. So what did change in 1989, 1991? Well, there was an increased focus on the weapons potential in the press coverage, as I mentioned, when the information about the reactor program North Korean program became public in 1991. Understandably, it tended to emphasize the weapons potential, and after the 1991 Gulf War, the first Gulf War, there tended to be a lot of argumentation that we're more worried about nuclear weapons potential in various countries, and so it would be a mistake to think that the tenor of public discussion and debate about these issues does not affect people's thinking in the intelligence community. And secondly, and perhaps more directly, 1991 is when the intelligence community learned after the first Gulf War about the extent to which it had underestimated